The importance of Bellingham's maritime history goes back to the mid-1850s and onward. People never came to Bellingham by any other way than boat originally. And therefore, it's always been a boat building seaport community. We live on the coast, and and in so doing, boat building and the working waterfront has always been a really important part of our culture. And it's a reason that I think a lot of people like coming to Bellingham. Today we're speaking from the Bellingham Maritime Museum, which is located down near the waterfront of downtown Bellingham. What's important for people to see when they come in is that we try to core off Bellingham and Whatcom County and Puget Sound's maritime history and then extend outward from there. We've got particularly a really good representation of companies like Bellingham Shipyards, which were hugely important to this town years and years ago during World War II, and then all the way through a company called Uniflight, which produced some of these iconic Vietnam-era patrol boats, river patrol boats. And we still get people, veterans and their families, who come from around the country to re-establish contact with boats that they served on during that period of time in Vietnam. Well, the first ships were built by one of the earliest pioneers named Roeder, who built some small wooden ships which were used in trade, and there was one called the General Harney, which was used during what was called the Pig War against the British. So right from the very get-go, the early 1850s, shipbuilding got a start, and it's just gone on ever since. Going back to the World War I era, the boat building in Bellingham at that time was pretty broadly diversified into smaller things, and I think dealt mostly with commercial fishing, which was the commercial fishing boats that fished in Puget Sound and up in Alaska and all over the Pacific. There was a company that was called Pacific American Fisheries that in its day, which was post-World War I and before World War II and thereafter, Pacific American Fisheries was the world's largest fishing company, fish processor, and it was all over the North Pacific and in the Aleutians and Alaska. But its world headquarters was here in Bellingham, in what is now the railroad depot down in Fairhaven. And so Pacific American Fisheries was the first really big company that produced a broad range of cannery tenders and fishing boats and so forth. The transition from commercial fishing and the fishing industry began to change just prior to World War II, when Arch Talbot, who was one of the giant figures of the Bellingham working waterfront, set up the Bellingham Shipyards. And Bellingham Shipyards produced, again, a very broad range of wooden vessels for the U.S. Navy, and in fact they produced more wooden vessels for the U.S. Navy than any company in the whole United States of America.
I am the grandson of Archibald Talbot, who was owner and operator of the Bellingham Shipyards from 1941 until about 1960. So my grandfather Arch in the 1930s was owner of a brokerage house in Seattle, and he found out about a shipyard in Bellingham that was having some financial difficulties and needed financing. In June of 1941, Arch came to Bellingham and purchased a shipyard from George Rang. And although my grandfather was not in the shipbuilding business, he thought this was a good investment. The shipyard had a contract from the Navy to build several large minesweepers, and it was a good time to be buying this shipyard, because within 6 months the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and the Navy came in with many more orders. And in particular, the Navy needed boats that were made out of wood to use as minesweepers. Minesweepers needed to be made out of wood because they didn't have as much of a magnetic signature, which is what would set off mines of the time. One of the reasons was that this was such a good place to build wooden hull minesweepers was the fact that in this area there was a big population of Scandinavian immigrants. And those Scandinavians knew how to work with wood. And so the shipyard at its height during World War II, when they received all these orders for minesweepers, had as many as 1,500 workers. And it was important that those workers knew how to work with wood and knew how to build ships. The Scandinavians were excellent at that. In fact, the Navy was so happy with the results of these vessels that they awarded a series of Navy E awards to the shipyard. In fact, the shipyard received 5 during the course of its history. So the shipyards, when World War II ended in 1945, the number of orders that it was received went way down. So my grandfather, Arch, realized he needed to diversify. He diversified into several businesses, some of which worked out and some that did not. One that did work out was Bellingham Cold Storage. He realized that there was a prosperous agriculture and growing fishing industry here, and so he used some of the land which he leased from the port to build cold storage warehouses. Another area that he started to get involved with in the shipping industry or the boating industry was the introduction of a new type of material, fiberglass. And the benefits of using fiberglass instead of wood was that it was relatively cheap and it was very light. So my grandfather formed a new company in the 1950s called Bellboy Boats. So during the 1950s, Bellboy developed this technology, and many of the workers there developed a know-how to work with this new material. And in addition to building smaller commercial craft for the average consumer, the Navy also had a need for fairly small boats, light boats that could be carried on the back of other boats to other military efforts. And so much later, in the 1960s, the Navy started ordering boats for the Vietnam War through a company called Uniflight.
A fellow named Art Nordvet, a tough little Scandinavian guy who had started at Bellingham Shipyards and worked his way up from the shop floor, put together a team, and they started the company Uniflight and started building the little runabouts and the family cruisers. And then the Navy came along and said, we really need a boat for Vietnam, and here's what we would like to think would work. And he put together a package, and the Navy pretty much immediately loved it. They bought, of the Mark I version, they bought 160 of those boats and pretty much sent all of them straight away to Vietnam. And they were really successful there and really popular. So that was kind of how the PBR, which stands for Patrol Boat River in the Navy way of nomenclature, that's what it stands for, and now they're just known as PBRs. For a very tiny little pocket rocket of a boat, it had a pretty massive armament, and that made it pretty popular with the crews. Of all of those boats that went over there, which was pretty specific to Vietnam, virtually, in fact, almost exclusively, all of them stayed there during the process of what some people remember with the Vietnamization, where all the equipment that the U.S. military had was turned over to the Vietnamese for use. So very few of them came back, and we're lucky in the museum that we have several examples of both the Mark I and Mark II, because hardly any are left anywhere. There's only a handful around the country. What happened after Vietnam was that Uniflight had become such a strong company. Again, in Bellingham, it was just a massively important company for the Bellingham and the regional economy. And then regrettably, in 1980, there was a fire in their main plant. And for a number of reasons, it just was a tragic event because it pretty well burned the company itself to the ground. Uniflight never recovered. The company was later, the vestiges and remains of it were picked up by Chris-Craft and Tollycraft subsequently, but no one could ever save the original Uniflight concept, and so much to everyone's horror and chagrin and sorrow, the company pretty much just ceased to exist, and its product line ceased to exist, and it was pretty tragic for the folks around here and for the economy. And now it's kind of worked its way through to where the boat building industry in Bellingham is more represented by very high-tech, high-quality things like foil-supported catamarans. A company called All American Marine builds some of the best of those in the world. So it's gone through the full course from the very first day in Bellingham until right today, a long, continuous heritage of boat building.